So I want to say something about, again, the relationship between commons-based peer production and capitalism. And just to give you an example, IBM, which made a turn towards open source about maybe 15 years ago, recently bought a company called Red Hat for $35 billion. This is the highest price they ever paid to acquire a company. So it gives you an indication that, you know, open source and the commons is not just a playground for people like me, but it's also something that is actually at the core of the capitalist system as well. So it's both are, in my view, true. And so one of the things that you might ask yourself is, you know, why would a capitalist company who needs to make money through scarcity engineering, making things scarce, why would they be open to use open source? And so one of the answers, of course, is that mutualization also works for capital, right? So if you imagine you have 10 companies that are each producing their own software for internal use, but most of these functions are really the same. Well, it makes a lot of sense for them to say, well, why don't we use one software? We all collaborate on it, and so we'll have an infrastructure that is a mutualized infrastructure. We still compete for other things, but we still have this common. So IBM, back in 15 years ago when I was reading about this, you know, they would claim they saved 90% of their infrastructural investments by going open source. So that's huge differential, right? There's another way to look at it. So let's assume that you create a small company today, like a biotech company. And you know, you get some venture capital and you can hire 25 people or 50 people, but even 500, doesn't really matter how much, right? So this is what you have. You have the research that's done by 500 people. It's exclusive, yes, it's for you. But imagine you join an open source network. Well, suddenly you have access to 25,000 researchers. So this is a huge difference, right? So by mutualizing R&D, especially if you're a small company with no money, low investment, so you're an entry in the entry phase, it makes a lot of sense to use open source strategies because you can save an enormous amount of investment by joining a pool of people and using that common knowledge. There's some price to pay because it's for everyone, so more people have the chance to compete with that kind of knowledge, but it still makes a lot of sense for a lot of people. And what you will see is that the more new an industrial sector, the more you see open source as kind of almost like a default strategy. I personally met a biotech startup person, and he said to me, my biggest mistake was to file for a patent. It cost me $800,000, cost me 2 years of effort, and it was absolutely useless. I would have better spend that money, you know, joining an open source community and developing real work and real knowledge, right? So this is kind of one thing. Well, so what I'm trying to say is that a company that joins an open source coalition is actually more competitive than a company that competes in an isolated way. It will have less access to knowledge. It will have less access to an innovation. So unless you're very, very big, you know, this would make a lot of sense. But even the biggest ones are doing it, like IBM. But I think it's kind of also interesting to see it in a third way, which is, so if we take Linux, if you're joining a coalition, 75% of the developers are paid by your competitors and yourself, but there's still 25% bonus, right? So all the people that can collaborate, that can improve open source, that will do it whether you pay them or not, just because it's open source and they can solve their own problems. So this is, you know, if you think like a capitalist, this means that you get more bang for the buck, basically, right? So even from a purely capitalist standpoint, this is a very important reasoning. And I would argue that this is also how these new infrastructures get funded and invested in. So let's take capitalism. Uh, kings, for example, in Europe in the Middle Ages, they could use the cities as an alliance against the counts and the dukes, because the kings were very weak in the Middle Ages. Like the French king, could not go out 70 miles without being attacked. So they had a symbolic function, but actually had not a lot of power. So for the kings to ally with cities, and the merchant guilds and the craft guilds, was, a power play, right? So that's why they actually supported the development of cities and everything that happened in the cities, right? Until one moment, capital was actually stronger than the kings, and the French king was beheaded. So this is not a contradictory. Things don't change just because people say they want to change, but because there are broad undercurrents in society where resources are actually put into play to make these changes happen. Okay, one more generic argument I would like to make is the following, and it is to do with the history of work. So once we move out of tribal cultures, where work is collectively driven, a lot of communality and stuff, and we get into class-based societies, works become coercive, right? So you are a slave, you're a serf, you're a domestic worker, you have to fight for the king and go to war. So all these things, become outside of your own control. It seems to me quite logical that this kind of work is not going to be very productive. So imagine you're a slave and they're not looking at you. Are you going to work? No, you're not going to work. So what I'm trying to say is that, so it's 1 + 1 is less than 2, right? So how to say this? So the collaboration is not, the work motivation is purely driven by external negative motivation, fear, right? If I don't bring enough whatever, then I'll be punished. This drives me to work. But this requires a very heavy investment from the managerial classes into command and control systems, which are very expensive, so they need a lot of people. So, for example, today in our capitalist system, 25% of the people work on protection, right? It's 1 out of 4 people that is actually not productive because they are guarding shops and companies and if you had like an open temple like in the Minoan civilization, you wouldn't need those people, right? You would have, these people would be working. So this is a very high price to pay in terms of societal investment. So what's the genius of capitalism in that context? So they change the logic of work from external negative motivation to external positive motivation, right? If I work hard, I'll get a good wage, or I can sell my products or whatever, right? So the motivation is much stronger, and I think you would agree with me, whatever we can say about the system, it's very productive. Compared to what came before, our systems are producing, enormous lifespans, health improvements, infrastructure improvements, so it's working. But it's not always working, and it's not working for everyone, right? And so here's one particular problem in areas where you have high unemployment. So money is scarce, investment is scarce, but you need money to mobilize people to work. So in situations where there's no capital, there is no work. This is a weakness of capitalism. Like, I don't know, when I was young, I would go to Mexico, and a lot of Mexicans were sitting in front of their, in front of their doors, just waiting because there was no money, right? So they couldn't get to work, basically. So now let's look, as a comparison, let's look at Wikipedia, for example. How many people there are coerced to work on Wikipedia? I don't think anyone, but who knows, right? Maybe there's some Wikipedia slavery, I've never heard about it. How many people make a living in a capitalist way from Wikipedia. I'm sure some do, but it's going to be marginal compared to Wikipedia. And yet, thousands of people in the world are working to improve the encyclopedia all the time. And so what they're doing is they're doing it out of internal positive motivation, right? So it's the passionate engagement that makes peer production so productive. Because you have 100% of the people who are there because they want to be there. I'm like that, and of course, the bad side of it is self-exploitation, right? You love what you do, so I'm sure that's true for you as well. So you end up way too much because you believe in it. It's, you're not just working for money; you're working for something you believe in, right? So this is the core of peer production, and that makes it a very productive system. So if you would express it 1 + 1 equals lesser than 1, that's coercive. 1 + 1 equals 1 equals 2 is capitalism. Then you could say that 1 + 1 is more than 2. That is what comes out of this new system. So at the core of it, you have this enormously productive and motivated workforce. And this gives peer production an enormous advantage. And then secondly, the capacity to share and innovate, right? So let's say 20 years ago, before the internet, or even longer, I was working in business right there at that moment. How would I learn? Well, maybe once a year we would go to a conference, maybe twice a year. I would talk with colleagues. We had some newsletters, but basically, this was a relatively static environment, right? We weren't learning all the time. Now, think about today. So if you're interested in something, you can learn an enormous amount of things in a very short time. So there's some articles about the Taliban, for example, right? Like Al-Qaeda, it took them 2 years before they developed IEDs. At the Taliban, it took them 6 weeks, right? So just 15 years later, the capacity of an organization to learn something has increased enormously. I've read, I don't know if I can find back the source, but some people claim it's 8 times faster than 20 years ago. I've seen some examples. This is nothing to do with business, but like I was in Brazil, and they have these, I forgot the name, but it's a dance style. Yeah, and so what people do is they do these routines, they put it on video, and within seconds, another team will copy the routine and add something to it. And so these styles of music are evolving enormously rapidly, much more so than 20, 30 years ago, right? So all of this is just kind of an argument to try to make you understand why these things are actually being done. It's not idealism. It's out of a pragmatic and practical advantages that this brings. Okay, now I want to say a few things about characteristics of peer production. Might be a bit boring because this is a list of words, but it explains what is specific to it, right? So you have capitalism, you have feudalism, you have what is specific about open source-based production, commons-based production. So, first word, anti-credentialism. So what's that mean? In the European Middle Ages, the way you would learn something would be to join a guild or a monastery or something, right? So you would basically learn from people older than you, masters, and you would go through these apprenticeship, fellowship, master levels. I think the Sangha still works that way, right? You learn from the older ones. And this was private knowledge, not private in the sense of like today, but private in the sense of in order to know how to do masonry, you had to be a part of a Masonic guild. Yeah? If you wanted to work on furniture, you had to be part of this guild. And the revolution of capitalism with Diderot and the Universal Encyclopedia was really an attempt to open up that knowledge to the whole society, so that the capitalists, basically, the entrepreneurs could say, we can do it too, and we can have cheaper workers than these expensive guilds, right? This is around the 16th century that this starts happening. So in other words, the first impulse is to universalize knowledge so that basically business people can start using it independently of the worker guilds. But the second step is you get chaos. And the market needs scarcity, right? So that's when intellectual property is introduced to make knowledge scarce and to protect investments. But also all these things like the Royal Society of the Arts, all these organizations that would validate and legitimate knowledge, right? So we went from a private guild system to a period of opening up and then a new enclosure of knowledge. Okay, why am I explaining this? I lost my thread. It's important that I find it back. Oh yes, anti-credentialism. So basically for 200 years, in order to do anything in our society, you needed credentials, right? You need a diploma. I'll give you an example from Ecuador, which is a real example. So Ecuador has a very good free software regulation. But it didn't work. The reason it didn't work is they had a few thousand computer scientists, maybe not that much, in a small country, maybe 3,000, who could earn 4 times more in the US than they can in Ecuador, and they can earn 2 times more in the private sector than in the public sector. But the public sector could not hire anyone without a degree. Okay, so totally blocked. Doesn't work. There's no one. So you have a free software legislation, but nobody's getting paid to do it because the economic system wasn't working for it, right? But today you have thousands of people that are self-educated in coding. You don't have to do computer science to know how to code. You know, you join forums online, you start trying it out. Some systems like Debian have even like actually a guild system where you can learn from more experienced developers and coders. And so in other words, you know, for fast-growing startups, there is no way that they can only rely on credentials, right? Even more so if you're an open source voluntary community, because you can't pay anyone. So, you know, it doesn't make sense to do vetting. So this switches to a situation where if you can prove you can do it, you do it. And that's it. So the role of credentials has enormously diminished in those environments. Of course, you need the skills. You need to prove your skills, but these skills are proved by your portfolio of past work. So I'll tell you a story that I think is true. I heard it from somebody in Berlin. So Google comes to Berlin. So what do? Well, first of all, they look at open source depositories. So they look at GitHub. And they look at all developers in and around Berlin, and they look at their code. Second, they look at social network, it's called social network analysis. So they put these coders in some kind of analysis software, and so here you get the best coders with the best relationships in Berlin. Then they ask for their diploma. But you see the difference, right? Even for companies who want guarantees, so they still ask for credentials, the logic is already as well really partially outside of the credentialists. And so that gives you enormous freedom to initiate initiatives that weren't possible before. So you can have like the Huffington Post, right? They don't hire anyone. I forgot how it works, but this originally was a non-credentialist civic journalism platform. Medium, if you want to write for Medium, you write for Medium. If you want to code for open source, you write open source code. So this is a very important change, right? The permissionless contributions and anti-credentialism, right? So you don't need a degree. This is not a primary factor. You need the knowledge, you need the skills, but the formal proof of it is less important than the practical proof of it, which is basically your portfolio and what did you do, and show us you can do it. Anti-rivalry, this is very important. Anti-rivalry means, in most systems, are rival. So that means if I'm thirsty and there's no water and you take my water, I'm thirsty, right? So it's a rival resource. No, it's a joke. Sorry. It's a joke, right? So, but you could say, especially in a desert, that water is a rival resource. It's not abundant. So then we talk about the second step are non-rival resources. These are resources that don't diminish by more use. I'm trying to find an example, but let's say air, probably. I think air for human beings is a non-rival resource. Yeah? What it means is you can use as much air, you can breathe as much air as you want, but you're not enriching the air. Does that make sense? Now, the third step is anti-rivalrous. This is, so let's assume that you would do something with the air that's useful for nature, right? So the more you breathe, the better air. That's not the case, but that's just an example. So this is what happens with free software. With free software, the more people use it, the more value it has. So it's anti-rivalrous. So there's not this thing that we use in the old commons, which is called the free rider problem, right? The free rider problem is the problem that you have some physical resource, it's not infinite, so you don't want people to piggyback without giving something. You need some kind of contribution to maintain the system. And in open source, that is not really the case. It's only the case in a very generic way. So for example, if you think about Wikipedia, it's sufficient that over time, the people that leave are replaced by new people. So as long as you have this general equilibrium, it will work, right? It doesn't depend on you as an individual person. It depends on a more generic exchange to the top. Sorry. Okay, so this is very important. And because of its network effect. So the more people contribute, the more people use, the better for the system. Communal validation, that's another important word. So let's say you want to go to the moon, or you want to send a satellite, Arduino satellite. So sure, everybody is welcome to write the code. But I don't think you want the thing to explode in the air, right? So here's the thing. So before you have a system where people are credentialed, so they're vetted beforehand. And then you have quality control systems in the system through a hierarchy. But that's very hard to maintain in an open source environment. First of all, so they're not vetted. And second, if you have a lot of people who are freely contributing and you're not paying them, you can tell them what to do, right? So command and control hierarchy is difficult to maintain in such an environment. So what you do is you switch to something called communal validation. So all the open source communities will have it, including Wikipedia, a layer of maintainers, editors, whatever you call them, who protect the integrity of the system. They don't tell you what to do, so it's not a command hierarchy, but they vet what you bring in. So they have the power to say no. This new feature is not good enough for our system. We say no. They have the power to do that. So it's a powerful position, but it's not at all the same as saying, please write that piece of code. It's a different, so it's this community of validators working together that protects the integrity of the system. So now I'm shifting to the idea of what kind of institutions are emerging in this new economy, right? So I think the maintainer system is an expression of the peer production community. So it's an institution. So when can we talk about institution? According to me, it's when it doesn't depend on the individual, but on a generic process, right? So if, let's say, you have a system and everything depends on me, and then I get sick and everything collapses, that's not an institution, right? That is a charismatic project. It's based on individual capacity that cannot be reproduced. So if we look at religion, for example, there were about 1,000 Buddhas at the time, but only one became the real Buddha because there was an institution after him that maintained the Sangha over 1,000 years, right? That's the institution. It doesn't matter which monk you are, you're a cog in the institutional system, and if you die, somebody else takes your place, right? So that's an institutional setup. And this is, I think, in society, how we maintain civilization. If it's purely based on affect, think about a marriage, I mean, if you would divorce every time you're angry with your wife or your husband, there wouldn't be many there would be many marriages around, actually, right? So you're staying with a person because there's something more than just a feeling at a particular moment. That's my point of view, right? There's a commitment, and that commitment is actually socially recognized, right? You actually, society or the mayor or whatever, or the priest saying, yes, you're married for the community, so you have people watching you as well. So this is an institution, right? Marriage is an institution. It doesn't depend only on the feelings of people. It has this little extra thing that makes people make efforts to stay even when they're not happy, actually, right? Okay, maybe a bad example, but okay. So this is what institutions do. So okay, institution of peer production community is for me this kind of maintainer system. Then there's a next step. Who deals with the infrastructure? Like in the Wikipedia. They need servers, they need money. Who deals with that? So that's the common good of a commons project, right? So if I'm just a coder and I want to do something for me, I'm not necessarily thinking about the common good of the project. I just need a piece of software. But that you cannot maintain an institution if it's just purely instrumental, right? So you need an institution that will take care of the life over time of this practice. So these are the FLOSS foundations. So FLOSS foundations are the free, libre, open source software foundation. So think about Linux Foundation, Wikimedia Foundation, Drupal Association. They almost all have them. I think Arduino doesn't have one. And this is always dangerous because you have the community, you have entrepreneurs who are making money on top of the commons, but that's a dangerous relationship, right? So it's dangerous when you don't have a neutral force that actually serves the common good of both the developers, the users, and the market players, right? It looks at the whole ecosystem and tries to maintain the ecosystem. Now, typically in blockchain, they don't think they need to do that. But I can give you many examples of why it's really difficult if you don't do it, right? Because this is called the tyranny of structures. You might have heard about it, especially in gender studies. So written by Jo Freeman, a feminist in the 70s. And her argument was, if you don't structure, don't believe you're free. Because what will happen is that certain people will accumulate charismatic power, right? And you cannot challenge them because there's no procedure. And so, this is what happens in open source. So I can see this in the P2P Foundation. So I started it, right? So I attract a few people. And then they attract a few people. But I'm in the middle. I'm still in the middle, right? Whether I want it or not. I have more relationships within the network because I was the first, because I have maybe not charisma, but at least something. I have an institutional memory. I have many things that make me more influential than the average person in my organization. This could be a bad thing, right? So we have a governance method. In blockchain, they usually don't, because they think the system will take care of it, the game theory incentives. What tends to happen, of course, is when they have a conflict, it becomes a dictatorship. So somebody will clean the mess up and not ask anybody's permission, right? So I think the Flots Foundation, you should see them as mediating organizations between the different stakeholder groups in an open source ecosystem. And then the third player is the entrepreneurial coalition. And I'd like to introduce the notion of Entropy Donors, which I'm trying to push, but it's not working. So, as you probably know, entrepreneur means taking in between. Yeah? Entre means in between, and preneur means taking. In my own language, Dutch, we say ondernemen in German. That means to take from below. But it's the same idea, right? So my Thai wife, when she talks about the rich people in Thailand, she uses two words: the eaters and the takers. It's part of the Thai language, right? So these are common people used to see these people on top, because they were asking for taxes and part of the production. And this is what entrepreneurs did, right? Entrepreneurs in the beginning were people doing arbitrage between something that you could find cheap somewhere else, and then they would sell it at a higher price in another place. Before it became capitalism as such, which produces, they were just traders. And trading is arbitrage. You take in between, right? You place yourself between supply and demand, and you take a cut of the trade. So entrepreneur is a word that I introduced to make us think about the difference between exploiting the commons, having an extractive relationship with the commons, or having a generative relationship with the commons. Yeah? This, I think, it's very important. So this is the key, because now we're coming to the core of the idea of how a commons economy should and could work. And this common idea is the following. We have a community. We're doing something together. We have a shared social object we all care about. In order to do that, we have created a quality control system, which I described, and we created a foundation which regulates the ecosystem. But then we need to make sure that we're not exploited by market players and by the system of capital. So one of the ways to do this is what I call value sovereignty. And this is a shift from market dictatorship, a market value dictatorship, and the freedom of a community to self-determine what it values. So the basic idea is, for example, in this system of accounting that I described during lunch, I'll quickly describe it. So it's called guerrilla translation. They're friends of mine. They're part of the P2P Foundation. And let's say you have 20 people translating for free from Spanish to English, English to Spanish. They do that because they're idealistic. They want to build bridges between Spanish language and English language, commons-oriented communities and activists. So this is what they were doing. Then suddenly they get reputation, right? Because they're doing so much good work and people start reading it. And so a publisher comes to them and say, I want to pay 2 people to translate this book because I know you know the language of the commons. So I'm pretty sure you can do this well, right? So here we have a problem. The problem is that 2 people are going to make a living in the market, but based on the collectively constructed social capital of a community. And so this is what contributive accounting is meant to solve, right? It's meant to say, if we allow this too much to happen, then people will stop contributing because they will feel exploited. You say, why should I work for free if only a fraction of the people extract the value? So here's how they solved it. They simply said, we'll count all the characters of translation. And this is one accounting system. Then we have a second accounting system, which is the market contracts that we have as a collective. And 15% of the market income will go to the network accounting system. Does that make sense? So basically what you've created is a way to redistribute the wealth in order to mitigate extractive potentiality, right? And so you create a generative scheme that even when people operate on the market, they're actually directly benefiting the community because there's funds going to the community. And there's many ways to do that. I'll tell you, this is actually a very capitalistic enterprise. It's called Ethos. And they do, for example, sports training for the British Army. You know, no lefties, nothing. Just train. But they organize as a network. And so what they do is they have two kinds of shares. And one share is you get when you have a client contract. So if anybody in the network gets a contract between an external partner and that network, they get share because they have helped people make a living, right? But there are a lot of people doing other stuff, like making connections, writing software that doesn't have immediate use, but is used for the community. They will get virtual shares. And every 5 years, they split the real shares into two, which means that the virtual shares would get valued, would get half of the value that's generated in the market by the community. I'll give you another example, just so that you understand the logic of it. Okay, this was in Ghent. So in Ghent we have a lot of something called temporary usage. So whenever there's a place that is free, like the docks, yeah, we have been industrializing for 30 years. So in Europe, the cities are trying to redevelop their docks into postmodern, knowledge-based, creative economy types of things, right? But often what they will do is, because there's an enormous amount of space problems in European cities, they will give it on a temporary basis to civic projects. Anywhere from 8 months to 2 years to 5 years. And usually it takes a lot longer than they say. So this is called temporary usage. So one of these buildings had 8 floors. And then the city did something very interesting and innovative. They said, instead of doing a competition, which means, 50 projects will try to get it, they will work very hard for a year to make a wonderful dossier of what we can do with the docks, and then one will get it. And 49 projects will just disappear. So it's enormous wastage, right? This is what you have with architecture competitions and stuff. Enormous wastage. So here they said, let's do a call for common. And we'll give the contract to those people who demonstrate that they can ally themselves with the greatest number of civic projects. So within 2 months, 70 organizations got together and they had to decide how to use the space. 8 floors. So they said, okay, every floor will have a team. Every team will be self-managed by the players who want to do something with the floor. But those players who want to make money will pay 70% of the rent, and those players who work directly for the common good will pay 30% of the rent. That is also contributive accounting, right? So if you want to have a restaurant, just sell your food, you pay a higher price, but that will subsidize the rent of people who are working with the poor and who want to do projects that are not directly for profit. So does that make sense? This is contributive accounting, right? It's just a way to create a generative relationship between the community and a market function. So you want to make sure that the market works for the commons and not against the commons. right? So no Airbnb model, no Uber model, but a fair BNB model. I don't know if you know that one, it's very good. Should have it in Hong Kong. Fair BNB redistributes 50% of its profit to community projects. It's an entirely different philosophy of doing, collective lodging. Okay. So value sovereignty is the capacity you have as a group to determine your own value system, to say, this is what we will reward in our community. So then you have the second step, which is creating a membrane between the community and the market, and to create the rules of engagement between the community and the market. And eventually to redistribute the income that comes from outside internally in a different way. This is what is done with tokens as well, right? Tokens, you can design tokens to be redistributed internally differently than outside. So I think that's another reason why tokens are interesting, even if we don't like the philosophy. I'm also proposing, and this is getting a bit of traction now, and this is called reciprocity-based licensing. So you have the commons, you have the market. But what you can also do is have a type of license which protects the common from exploitation by the private. So this is a paradox, right? So typical open source licensing is actually in technical terms a communistic license. Everybody can contribute and everybody can use. This means IBM can use Linux. And you may think this is a good thing because it brings a lot of investment, a lot of work. So most open source developers are happy with that system. It works, it innovates very fast. But let's take another example. Let's take people who develop actual machinery, yeah, and maybe a co-op or solidarity economy project. You might think a bit differently about it, right? Because if you work in open source software, you need a person with a body connected to the network. As you know, they could be living with their parents until they're 42, like in Italy, no problem, right? If you know how to code. So what I mean to say is the investments are relative, right? It's a low entry cost. Once you want to make things, right, you want to move from open source immaterial production to open source material production. For example, you want to develop a new type of machinery, like I mentioned the example in Brazil, distributed torrefaction of coffee, smaller machines that you can place with the farmers so they can burn their own coffee. Do you want a big company to say, oh, that's interesting, it's open source, and they'll have 10, 20 times more money to invest in these things, right? So this is a particular problem for especially the most ethical players in the physical economy. So this is called reciprocity-based licensing, or copy fair. You have copy left, you have copy right, in the middle you have copy fair. Copy fair says the following: anybody can use the knowledge, but if you want to make money with it, it's subjected to a reciprocity agreement. It can be very easy. For example, the Fair Shares Association, which is like a model of ownership in the UK, in the solidarity economy, you have shares for funders, founders, workers, and users. It's a specific system to create a shared property. And what they say is everybody can use our Creative Commons non-commercial license. So if it's just about the knowledge, you can use it, you can learn, you can share. But if you want to create a fair share company, you need to become a member, pay some money, and this will give you the Creative Commons commercial license. Yeah? So do you see the difference? It creates a requirement of reciprocity so that capital is obliged to adapt to the requirements of an internal network. So it's basically a return to the idea of an ethical economy. So if you were living in the Middle Ages, and I'm pretty sure it was the same in China, we didn't have a capitalist market like today. We had regulations. For example, in medieval cities in Europe, the traders could not sell bread at a free price until 5 p.m. in the afternoon. In other words, everybody had to get fed first at a fixed amount of money, because otherwise you would have a riot. If people are hungry, they burn the castle. So you didn't want that, right? So you had a requirement that merchants took into account the real situation of the society. They couldn't just think about themselves, right? So this is, of course, we may not agree with the ethics of the time, but it is an ethical economy, which is what we had until probably the late 17th century. I don't know if you read Polanyi, The Great Transformation. So in England, until, I'm not sure when, 1831, they had a basic income called the Speenham land system. So if you were poor, you would always get food, right? And this is what people like Adam Smith didn't want, because they wanted a free price for labor, right? So in the Middle Ages, we had something called just pricing, which is based on the Christian idea of fairness, and that became free pricing, right? Just as today we have free trade and fair trade. Fair trade is an ethical economy format which takes into account the various players in the ecosystem. In free trade, you don't care, right? If the coffee farmers are starving because there's a crisis, well, that's too bad for them. It's not your problem as a company. Okay, so does that make sense? You have a community, value sovereignty, you have a membrane, you have regulations like a copy fair license that can create a generative market form that works with the commons. So that's basically what people like us are trying to do, and just maybe show you this. Basically, this is the approach that we take in the P2P Foundation. So this is netarchical capitalism, right? And so what we say is they exploit people, they're extractive, but actually the underlying idea is interesting. Idle sourcing is something that we need to do. So why allow platforms to be extractive? Why not create our own platforms, right? I'll do it here, sorry. It's easier if you, yeah. So we were there, some of you, right? We had a platform co-op conference in Asia that was meant to do that, right? To show and to see what's happening in Asia around this idea of owning our own platform. So the extraction can be reinvested in new services on a continuous basis. And this is very important. I think I mentioned the monasteries in my first lecture. And so the idea is they were interacting with the market. They had tithes from the people, 10%, but everything was always invested in collective infrastructure. So they became very rich, right? This is if you mutualize, you're not wasting buying yachts. You're actually always continuing to invest in your own ecosystem. So then we talked about the distributed capitalism form, so the blockchain and Bitcoin systems. And here I would argue that we need ledger cooperatives. This is what my last project is about, so it's almost finished. Actually, I've done my work, so now it's the layout. And this is basically the idea. So one of the things I did was making a grid, right? So how do we make it work for the commons? So for example, in terms of currencies, the anarcho-capitalist currencies are commodity currencies, meaning their value is exclusively determined by supply and demand. Bitcoin, Ether, all these currencies are market-based, right? And they're extractive. Well, what about mutual credit currencies and asset-based currencies, right? So if you have mutual credit currencies, you solve the problem that capital has, that you can't do anything without money. So let's see how that works. So I'm doing business with you, and we have a big crisis. So you make houses, and I sell bricks. So we don't have money anymore. What we do? Well, we could make an agreement and say, let me pay you 1/3 in an IOU. So what I'm saying to you is, you get 2/3 in Swiss franc, and 1/3 I promise to pay as soon as I can. If you accept this in a network, this is money, right? If you trust that I'm going to pay you 1/3, then you can give it to Kinchi, right? Because she knows that I will pay you, so the money will come. So, and of course you can make it more complicated and have some collateral and stuff. So there are a number of systems like that in the world, and they work very well. One is called the WEIR in Switzerland, 60,000 small businesses, and it has a proven counter-cyclical effect. Meaning whenever the Swiss economy goes down, people use more WEIR, and they're still in business. Because if we didn't do that, we would all go bankrupt, right? So the fact that we can use these IOUs, this mutual credit, you're basically offering me credit. But not as a person, we do it in a network. And so that IOU is money. So in this case, we've solved one of the major problems, which is we can't do anything without money. We've solved it, right? We have created interest-free debt credit system, basically. So this is also called the credit commons. But the other thing we can do to move the things towards the commons is to use asset-based currencies. So why is this important? Bitcoin doesn't tell me anything about the world. Just like the oil price doesn't tell us anything about the world, right? We can use oil, but oil is cheap. So in other words, the pricing mechanism only looks at supply and demand. It doesn't look into our ecological and social situation. What if we had something like Fishcoin? This is a real project. So Fishcoin says, we calculate how many fish we can fish, let's say in the Mediterranean, and and we produce coins that represent the volume of fish. So then suddenly you have a coin which tells you something about the environment, right? The amount of fish coin that you can use actually represents a real sign of the world. This is the basic problem with capitalism. We are living in an externalities-free, double-entry system where nobody knows what the ecosystem needs, right? This is about integrating the ecosystem information in everybody's decision making. So there's Solo Coin, there's Mangrove Coin, there's a number of initiatives that try to do this. Okay, then blockchain projects use game theory, competitive game theory. What about cooperative games? So we could think about, instead of incentivizing people for competition, we could think about incentivizing people for cooperation, right? This is a subdomain within game theory that looks at how to stimulate cooperation. So you see, cryptocurrencies, asset-backed mutual credit currencies, smart contracts into Ostrom contracts, competitive games into cooperative games. So I just want to give you a way of thinking about these things, right? So it's not enough to say this is bad, because it's actually a new form of capitalism, which is going to influence our lives, which is going to manage what we can do. So what we can do is tweak and transform it, right? And think about how we can do that. For example, and this is another very important concept called transvestment. So investment is using capital to create more capital. So I use money to make more money. Transvestment is using capital to make more commons. So in Spiral, which is a New Zealand-based coalition of social entrepreneurial projects, they're like 18 when I visited them. They had 300 members. They use something called Lumio, which is an open source decision-making tool, which I described earlier on. But they needed money to develop it. So what they did is they created a wall between the for-purpose entity and capital. So this is basically you take the money and you say, I will give you 5% for 10 years, but after 10 years, the code will go to the commons, right? So basically you've transformed capital in something that creates more commons. So that's the generic idea of transvestment, is to look at mechanisms where you can use the huge overflow of capital which exists today. They don't know what to do with their money. And for a long time we had negative interest rates, so they really were losing money, into a system where you can say, well, if you invest in us, this can, you can still make money, but you're actually doing something good as well, right? So this is the idea of transvestment. Okay. One more thing I'd like to say about this. And this is one of my favorite projects, and this is very, very important. Under capitalism, we cannot fund regenerative activities. We cannot. So if you're an industrial farmer, you poison your land, you make cheap food, this is good. If you're an organic farmer, you improve the soil every year, it's very difficult to make a living. You're not paid for it, right? So the name of the game is to keep costs as low as you can and sell as much as you can. So there is no investment, there's no generic motivation to fund regenerative activity. So here's a project that I think might work, and that's called Regen Network, Regenerative Network. And they have a concept called ecological state protocols. And we could have social state protocols as well. So the state of the ecology. So let's say we have to do decarbonization of our economy. Instead of doing a competitive bid or a carbon market, you could say the following. Anybody in our society who wishes to collaborate to decarbonize can do so. So you create an open, permissionless dynamic. And we will verify your impact, and we will put it on a ledger. And we will tokenize the value that you have brought, right? So this is easy to do, it's technical. The next step is more difficult, but it's really crucial. And this is something I call circular finance. The basic idea of circular finance is to negotiate sharing of benefits from people who profit from the commons. So here's one example. It's a community land trust movement in France, fairly successful. They have like 65, is it million? That's not so much, but anyway, they have a sizable amount of capital to buy land out of private hands, put it in a trust, and this will keep the rent low for organic farmers. Because today in Europe and the United States and Australia, it's all the same. If you're young, you cannot buy land. It's too expensive. And so the farmers are now on average, like in Thailand, they're like 58 years old. It's everywhere in the world the same. Once their kids go to school, they don't want to do farming. And it's also more and more difficult to do it economically, right? On the other hand, we have a huge influx of neo-rural people who want to do organic farming, and they don't have money to buy the land. Okay. So Community Land Trust buys the land, gives low rent, and so they've proven that the more organic farmers you have in a county, this is in France, the less the government has to spend on depollution of water, right? You've got the rain coming, it's clean, no poisons in the ground, so the water is just stays healthy. Today what will happen is the government will spend 100 millions of euros less, but the people who have done it, right, who have created a common good effect, who have actively contributed to common good, will not get anything from it. So in this system like Regen Network, you can do this. You can make an agreement with all the players. They have a benefit from a common good activity, and you can start funding it in a a virtuous cycle. So this is just basically to explain to you how we can think about these things and find new mechanisms. Okay, so so I didn't talk about these two. So two things are happening today, actually three. One is local urban commons. So in Ghent, we calculated that there were 50 urban commons projects in 2006 and 500 in 2016. Friends of mine in a green think tank have calculated for the whole country is the same, tenfold increase. Other people have calculated in Catalonia, in the Netherlands, same. So this is really happening. People in Europe, probably here as well, but I don't have the figures, they're saying, okay, there's things that need to happen. The government is not doing it, the market is not doing it. Let's just do it. Let's self-organize. Let's create energy co-ops. Let's create collective purchasing of organic food. Let's create mobility co-ops. Let's create a housing collective. Like in Ghent, there's like more than 40 co-housing projects. So people, they have a community land trust, so the land is common, a housing co-op, the houses stay cheap, the rent stays cheap, and then co-housing is about mutualizing certain services, like, for example, guest rooms, right? Why does everybody need a guest room when your family only comes once a year? So you can have a co-housing with 15 families and one house for guests, right? So it's mutualized, so whenever your parents come, you have a place. It doesn't have to be, so you lower your investment needs. So this is happening at the local scale, and I think I told you, so small, local, open, and connected. So it's very important to realize today that local urban commons are actually also global at the same time, because they're learning from everywhere, right? They are, like if you do fair B&B, it's not just happening in Amsterdam, it's happening in a number of cities. If you do an energy co-op, there's a lot you can learn from the German experience, where 60% of renewable energy is produced by consumer collectives, right? Not the state and not the big companies, but energy co-ops. So all these things are happening. And then above you have what we talked about, global open source communities creating collective knowledge. There's one thing that is happening now, I think, which is what we call cosmo-local production. And this is also very important at the ecological level. So apparently we're spending 3 times as much to transport things than to make them. So you think about a tennis ball in Wimbledon, it has 400 different products in it, and it has traveled like 40,000 kilometers or something, right? The miles that it... So, or take a really bad example, it's almost good for China, but it's not good for the environment. So people fish shrimp in Boston, they send it to China to peel it, and then it goes back to Boston, right? Or talk about the apples in Chiang Mai, they come from China, go to Bangkok, and then they come back to Chiang Mai. It's weird. Or talk about the butter and the milk in New Zealand, in Patagonia. It comes from New Zealand, but Patagonia has the same biotope, so it's destroying their own industry. Anyway, so there's the things. So material globalization has a number of issues in terms of the human footprint. One of the ways you could think about it is to change the logic of production to an idea where all the knowledge is shared, but the production is maximally relocalized. So cosmo-local, right? If it's light, it's global and shared. If it's heavy, it's local. So this is probably too extreme. So we can use a word for that, which is called subsidiarity, which means at the lowest possible level. That makes sense, right? And we move from what we call economies of scale, which is the capitalist way of thinking. So you make a lot of things of a unit that brings down the price, to economies of scope. Meaning, if you make a car anywhere in the world, you can basically profit from all the innovations all over the world, right? So if, let's say you use biodegradable coverings for the car, you can learn from the whole world, right? You're not dependent on a single company, so that knowledge can be used everywhere. So it still has to be proven that this is economically viable under capitalism, but it's starting. For example, energy and food. In the urban commons, we already moved from redistribution to production. So we already produce our own energy in a common-centric way, and there's a lot of organic food that is produced that way. So we call this community-supported agriculture, which is based in agreement between a group of consumers, a group of producers, in solidarity with each other. So that's growing like wildfire. Or collective purchasing or grocery co-ops. So the thing is that we are actually already creating today, in energy and food, already doing cosmo-local production. Of course, the question is how far can we go with this? And we don't know yet, but this is what we are pushing for, and to study this. Okay. Right, so now we can finish the circle. So netarchical platforms into platform co-ops, distributed capitalism and private blockchain into ledger cooperatives, urban commons into cosmo-local cooperatives, because they're both local and cosmological. And then the last point is very important, is protocol co-ops. So we talked about Airbnb, we talked about Uber, and the key idea here is the following. We can use the cities of the world as a global governance mechanism for transnational cooperation, right? In a time where the nation state is blocked, because transnational capital blocks change at the local level. So if you're familiar with Polanyi, did I mention that the first time? Probably, but very quickly. So you have these swings in society between lib and lab. So basically, if you believe in the conjunctive cycles, so you have a crisis, and then you have a renewal of the productive system. New managerial systems, new ways of working the land, a new technology, new energy source. So all this comes together and creates a period of high growth. This is good for labor. But at the end of it, so this is the 70s, after 30 years of high growth, capital is in trouble because they can't make enough money. So we have a supply crisis, and we have a revolt of capital, and then we have a second period, the neoliberal period, right? So this swing, we can trace it back to, I think, 1848 or something. So we've 5 or 6 of these cycles. And so normally what would happen, so at the end of the second cycle, we have, it's bad for labor, it's good for capital, but we have a demand crisis. People don't have money. People have too much debt. Companies have too much debt, right? This is what we have now. And at those periods of time, we have massive mobilization of society to pressure the market to be more embedded again in society. So today we see left populism and right-wing populism. They both have different ideas about how to do it, but they both want to strengthen the nation state to control global flows, right? But of course, the power of transnational finance today is so great that any nation that tries to do this is immediately punished. So we have a problem. The problem is the lib-lab pendulum is not working anymore. So my idea is of course that we can use the city level and create transnational cooperation formats so that we have global civic society, open source communities, we have global entrepreneurial coalitions working with open source communities. But you also have the potential of creating global protocol cooperatives to mutualize our provisioning systems, right? So this is the idea that if you don't want Uber and Airbnb to destroy your local economy, you can do Airbnb and MuniRide. But why would you do this alone? Why would every city in the world develop the same software 200 times? It doesn't make sense. So what we should be looking at is coalitions of cities, coalitions of ethical finance, coalitions of impact investment, coalitions of cooperatives or solidarity economic players that together start developing global open depositories to mutualize our provisioning systems, right? So if you want to do MuniRide, like a ethical version of Uber, you'd know how to do it. If you want to do community supported agriculture, you would know how to do it. So this is actually all happening, but without the cities, right? So now we have open food networks, so there's a number of these projects, but they don't have money. So this is my suggestion, is that we should be looking at these coalition building. So what's happening now is only negative. So we have 40 cities that are coalescing to regulate Uber and Airbnb. But that's only negative, right? It just tells them what they can do. At this stage, we have nobody thinking that maybe we should build alternative, common infrastructure so that every city in the world can do this change. I hope it makes sense. Anyway, this is what we're working out. Okay, I think maybe for today we can do some discussion, and then I will talk about the government and public commons cooperation tomorrow. Is that okay for you? So I took a bit longer, but I hope it's okay.